Good afternoon, and
They say that
welcome
someday AI will transform the human race. Well, today, you're a little busy transforming your call center, dealing with millions of customers a year, like this one.
No, I'm pretty sure I didn't order a squirrel playing a guitar.
That's why you work with Watson. It works with your systems to resolve calls faster and improve customer satisfaction.
I detected fraud and helped reassign a new credit card.
Honey, they're overnighting us a new card.
For AI that works with tools you already use, choose Watson.
Hello.
The best AI for the job.
Good afternoon, and welcome to the IBM Watson Marketing Stage. This afternoon's panel discussion will be followed by a brief question and answer session, and questions may be entered by going to the Slido link in the Advertising Week app. Select the IBM Watson Stage, and this will allow you to both submit and vote for questions that are posted. And now, please welcome to the stage our moderator, Vince Lynch, and our panelists, Ophir Tans and Katie Weber.
Hi, everyone. How's it going? Hi. We probably should have walked up earlier. It took us like 17 minutes to walk from the back of the room. So we're here to talk about applied AI. How do you apply AI in your enterprise or in the work that you're doing? And it's kind of a tricky thing because AI itself as a space is incredibly vast. So it's just this massive space to begin with. And then now we're in a place where AI is going mainstream. So the use case for AI is now being applied to all the people that are coming into touch with it, such as the people on this panel and all of you out there as well. And then that's just going to continue to extrapolate as it goes more and more mainstream. So you're going to have, at some point, there'll be 7 billion people on the planet that will all be looking at the output of AI and using that in some way. So the potential use cases are incredibly mental when you think about it that way, because there's all of those 7 billion people that are applying the output of AI and then also their own creativity and their curiosity with what they think about that output and how they apply it. So it just is a very big and hard thing to wrangle down, which is, I'm really glad we decided to tackle that ourselves. Fortunately, we have 2 people here, and I'm just hanging out, that are really good at the space and understand it really well. And Katie Weber, to my right, is the VP of Partnerships at Quartz, and they're doing some really interesting things there, and I'll let her explain it to you. And then Ophir Tans, who is the CEO of GumGum. And Katie, can you start by explaining a little bit about what you guys are doing at Quartz?
Yeah, sure. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. So I work at Quartz, which, for those of you who don't know us, we are a global business news brand. And at Quartz, we launched about 6 years ago to help people writ large really understand the way that the global economy is changing. And so while we are a publisher and an editorial entity, we put equal parts emphasis on the journalism and the editorial as we do the actual products that we build. And that's the place, I think, where when it comes to topics like AI, which are having massive disruption across the entire world, as Vince just explained, we have a unique position where we not only report and investigate and cover that topic pretty rigorously, but also help to exploit ways to bring the AI and machine learning and NLP and all the other sort of acronyms into our own work processes so that we can learn from them, experiment with them, and then ultimately also help our partners understand how to show up in this radically new sort of data-powered world.
Awesome. Ophir, can you give us just an overview of GumGum?
Sure. Great to be here. Thanks for attending. So GumGum increasingly is looking more and more like a holding company for computer vision-driven businesses. We have a very scaled-out business in the advertising category, where we use computer vision to target marketing messages to visual content. We have a newer sports division, which uses computer vision to analyze broadcast television and social media to identify valuations for sponsorships, sports sponsorships. And we also have a newer sort of budding healthcare division, which operates in the field of dental.
Awesome. And IV.ai is kind of on the language side of what Ophir is doing. So we focus on hard language problems for enterprise, where we focus on customer service, automated conversations around online retail, and hard, deep social listening challenges. We're making sense of lots of crazy noise in relation to language. So now could we talk about some example use cases of how you guys are actually applying AI with your companies?
Sure. So one of the purest places that we're using AI is in the Quartz Bot Studio. The Bot Studio was born within Quartz about a year ago, originally out of a grant from the Knight Foundation, which invests in projects that further the future of journalism. And we were able to leverage that grant to experiment with many forms of AI, largely in messaging and voice platforms. And we learned a lot through that process when it comes to sort of changing the shape of what it means to have a loyal user, what it means to build a one-on-one relationship with any of our readers, and from that actually launched a commercial arm to the Bot Studio. So the Bot Studio is central to Quartz, servicing both the one team services the editorial and Quartz brand projects, and then another team within the studio services our commercial partners. And so what that looks like in practice, to give example, is we actually partnered with HBO earlier this year around season 2 of Westworld. And if there are any fans of Westworld, you know that that show really pushes, I'd say, to the bleeding edge of what a future state of technology could look like or play out across society. And so it was this perfect situation where we had this show that was already pushing on these narratives of data and privacy and security, and we were able to use the technology to create a heavily narrative-driven experience that actually allowed people to chat with Tess, which was a host that we created, and it was a really fun project to experiment with what it means to have that really intimate one-to-one dialogue with someone, and also what it means to take them down a narrative journey that makes them come back every single day after every single episode airs, and really kind of toy with their notion of what reality is, which is very much the premise of Westworld. But throughout that, we were able to marry, I'd say, and this is, I think, part of what's interesting about all the talk about AI is, for us, it's very much the marriage of the technology and the human. And so we have a team of writers who are expert in writing for messaging platforms. So to any of you that go on and play with it, you'll feel like it's fairly automated, but there's actually a really strong writer team that's creating that experience on top of a technology stack. And so through that, we were able to do some really pretty fun things and pretty, I think, first of its kind things, like introducing specific clues to one person but not to another, which then generated things like a Reddit community on the side where people were gathering to solve clues, solve puzzles, and come back to the messenger experience and really engage in that way. And with the underlying AI and NLP running beneath it, we were able to ensure that when they came back, we knew who they were, we knew where they left off, we knew what information they had, what they didn't. And so that kind of marketing and that kind of show level engagement would not have been something that would have been possible without the use of that technology in a really creative way.
Nice. And Ophir, GumGum, just the application side.
Yeah, so I mentioned everything we do is sort of driven by computer vision, particularly how that applies to sort of the media categories that we operate in. So with advertising, you have this situation where people, by and large, primarily engage with visual content more than any other piece of content, if you judge by sort of eye tracking studies and other metrics. But a lot of the sort of targeting and brand safety efforts as it relates to, say, online advertising is really driven by textual analysis. So what GumGum attempts to do is we look at the entirety of the content on the page. So obviously we'll look at the text, but we'll also look at the visuals, whether that reside in video or imagery. And there's really two large benefits to that. One is we're able to place brands in completely brand-safe environments, which I'm sure for many folks in this room that have been tracking the news, that's been an increasing issue because all of the existing sort of brand safety tools that everyone is sort of relying on today don't actually look at image-oriented content, and that obviously could be problematic if the text doesn't match up with what's in the imagery. And then there's also this notion of being able to contextually align marketing messages to the greatest extent possible. And if you're able to look into an image, say, and understand the make and model of a given vehicle, that obviously is adding to your overall knowledge of a page and your ability to sort of target that content. As it relates to what we do in sports, we're basically taking a process that has historically been highly extrapolated, very manual and very labor intensive, with effectively humans coding every moment of sponsorship exposure and the quality of that exposure, and that being extrapolated into sponsorship values. And we've automated that whole process. We effectively use machines to look at every single frame of every video, every image on relevant social media platforms, consumption channels like Twitch, and we're able to sort of deliver a true and transparent understanding of what these sort of effective ROIs are for these sponsorships. And that really is a night and day difference versus sort of what existed before. I think it's a very elegant example of AI making a marked difference in accuracy and effectiveness of a given unit of measure.
Yeah, absolutely. Those are both two really good use cases. One of taking human curation and human creativity and applying it through an automated lens so that more people can engage with what those writers are writing more efficiently through bots. Another one which is taking images and a vast amount of image data and making sense of it so that you can apply it to safety and apply it to knowledge around a given sponsorship or a given value proposition for a company. For us, it's around understanding of language in like really big noisy spaces. So if it's like social listening, currently you get like, this is a keyword that we see on social listening, or this is something that people are saying, or these are how many followers they have. And this is like, we build big models around that to make sense of like, if you're finding influencers, how you find them. If you're trying to make sense of trends that are emerging and what's coming up that is going to be new and inspiring, you can do all that with our models as well. And then it goes as far as customer service and automation of customer service. So regardless of what the customer is saying to the company, it can understand that and then automate the response that goes back to the customer. So our high watermark with that is 96% automation, where basically 4% of the time we can't figure out what the customer is saying, usually because of some kind of human error where the customer doesn't know what they're asking for, they called the wrong number. And then the rest of the time we can automate that if we're building against a certain channel. And a good example of that is what we did for Aeromexico, where we automated their conversations through Facebook Messenger. That went really well, and it was announced at F8 in 2016. And then when WhatsApp opened up and you were able to then communicate through WhatsApp as a platform, they were able to take that same AI that was able to automate the conversation and apply it through the WhatsApp platform, which is essentially like text. So you can rely on images, you can't rely on carousels and rich media, but you could rely on back and forth conversation. And they were able to jump on that platform right away, and they were seeing 10x higher engagements through WhatsApp than they were any other platform that they've been through, including email or any push notification out from their brand. So you just see these like really interesting ways of thinking about something that's really hard, figuring it out for one space, and then you can just start applying it to other places. And again, I guess both your companies have done that. Starting from a traditional company that's in the traditional media space, it seems like that would be even harder because it didn't tend to be the place where innovation came from.
Yeah.
But you guys you're taking it from bots, and you're also kind of going beyond there. Can you talk a little bit more about that, or other things that you found inspiring in this space?
Yeah, for sure. I think Quartz plays in a lot of different spaces. I think when we are at a place like Advertising Week, we tend to get lumped in with the sort of traditional media companies. If we're at a tech conference, people know us for a set of very different things. And I think generally our philosophy has been to to launch in a way that allowed for really, really best-in-class user experiences, no matter what part of the business that is. And we have a lot of conviction around that, have had that since the very beginning, whether it's sort of saying no in 2012 to traditional advertising formats, or launching a bot studio at a time when, to be honest, the platforms are really nascent, right? There isn't tremendous scale yet across a lot of these voice devices or messaging platforms, but we tend to plant a stake in the future and experiment in ways that lead toward that technology and that vision coming true. And so I think we are certainly a media company, we are a publisher, and we have, I think, a responsibility as a publisher to not just report on the trends that are shaping the future, but to actually apply them to our own business. So a couple of experiments going on right now at Quartz. We have a gentleman within our technology team who built his own NLP. And what he's doing with that is using it as a mechanism to determine bias, tone, sentiment, beyond just the keyword or the image or whatever it might be, to actually discern within our own editorial content and content more generally, how can we detect bias or understand sentiment or intent or interest from consumers in a way that can result in a much better experience. And so, there's the functional ad targeting by audience and that sort of thing. I think there's a world of possibility to layer on top of that is yet to be fully explored.
Well, Fear, how about you? Any applications that you're seeing that you thought were interesting and obviously, you guys have nailed down such a great use case for your company. Are there other things you're seeing out in the market that you think are interesting but maybe don't apply or maybe do?
Yeah, I think what's happening in the market and what's going to happen over the next 5 to 7 years, or the near term is really dramatic. And I think the ways in which the world's going to be most dramatically affected isn't necessarily the most obvious or sexy, but if you look at what's happening out there that's being really driven by AI, there's dramatic increases in crop yields, like in all these developing countries. There's a dramatic increase in accuracy of security apparatuses, as it relates to things like facial recognition and otherwise. There's dramatically more profits already being generated by a number of companies, and that's going to continue as well. So I think that the impacts will continue to sort of multiply. I think a lot of the most meaningful stuff will be happening while we're focusing on self-driving cars, which obviously is very meaningful and interesting. But I recently learned that there's basically 7 minutes of a given commercial flight that's flown by the airline pilots.
Wow.
Like the rest is just driven by the machine, which is effectively increasingly AI as well. But it's a very powerful technology, but it's also just massively sort of narrow to effectively get it to operate to solve a given problem today. So I think we're going to see all these changes, but they're going to also be manifest by an improvement in the underlying technology, which is just going to sort of increase the rate of all these types of changes.
It's so interesting, isn't it? Like the narrow use case is the most important thing to be thinking about when you're working with machine learning, because it's a powerful tool and there are lots of different algorithms out there and different approaches that you can take to try to solve a problem. But if you aren't focused on that specific output that you're looking for, then you don't know what to think about from a training data point of view and how to clean the data and then train the model based on what you're trying to get to as an output.
I think that's a really interesting and relevant point, and that's like we're just so much in inning one of this entire thing. And it's such a powerful pattern recognizer. It's a powerful predictive analytics tool. But it's so incredibly narrow that like just trying to solve an adjacent problem to the one that you've solved is basically starting from scratch.
Yeah.
And I think that that's what a lot of people that are trying to apply this in market need to realize.
Yeah.
You need to be hyper-focused in a very vertical fashion on solving very specific problems if you want to utilize this technology effectively. Otherwise, it's not going to work that well, and it'll be problematic.
I think one of the things too is we just finished a project at Quartz that went really deep in understanding AI in healthcare. And I think you started out here, which is that the kind of ease of accessibility to a lot of this technology is pretty much there, right? You said when you started working in the space, it was really specialized, really difficult to get access to this kind of technology to even do this kind of experimentation. And so at Quartz, we try to do as much of that as we can. And so we just did a project called Prescription AI, which looked at what the opportunity is in the healthcare space for a more sort of accessible healthcare state powered by AI. And we actually partnered with a company called MD.ai, as well as 2 radiologists to experiment with how we could build an algorithm that would actually detect lung cancer. And actually, in a matter of hours, we had a fairly solid working prototype with about a 93% accuracy rate to what doctors were proving out. And so this is a journalism project. This is not published in medical journals. This is not prolific everywhere in the world right now. But I think if you look at what we were able to do in a couple of days, it points to the broader opportunities. There's a lot of really interesting work being done around organ transplants, organ donors, and taking it from that one-to-one network into what happens when you have a more sophisticated algorithm that can actually match you with people all around the world. And this is happening now. And I think to your point, we're writing about it, but it's not trending in the news, right? And there's these really, I think, optimistic and positive stories when balanced with responsibility and the right kind of data to actually make that stable. That's where we tend to see, I think, a really interesting application of what at the core could be image recognition, right? Could be NLP, but applied to a much more important sort of topic terrain is really interesting.
I'm always quite jealous of the healthcare space because the data is so well structured. It's clean. Like if it's an MRI scan for cancer, it's been really well categorized and tagged by the doctors that have done it over time, and there've been lots of examples, and they know what's good and they know what's bad. So they can train on this is the beginning of the problem versus this is no problem at all, and over time. So the data set is so rich, and also it's done in a perfect environment, or at least attempting to be a perfect environment, a clean environment.
Well, that's not really our experience with it.
Really?
Yeah. So we've been collecting dental X-rays for like 2.5 years and developing these models to identify pathologies and issues. And I've also familiar with other folks that do this. But the reality is
why did you focus on dental first? That's a good question.
We focused on my father was a dentist, retired. Honestly, it was we started collecting this data before we decided to commercialize it. Okay. Because we thought it was a worthwhile effort for a number of reasons. And it seems that dental is always the sort of the forgotten medicine, but it's also a very large market opportunity and it's highly visited.
Nobody likes the dentist.
And it turns out, for a number of reasons I won't get into, so I think a little off topic, that it's actually a very opportune space in the ways that a lot of other radiological, AI for radiology of type X isn't, because of the inherent resistance in market. But what you find if you look at most X-rays is actually very disparate classification systems, and it's mostly charts with handwriting on it.
All right.
So when you want to train a neural network, say,
right.
You actually need localized data. So you actually need to draw a box around the given issue, and you need to tag it specifically, and
right.
you need to do that,
and you have to
tens or hundreds of thousands of times per pathology.
Decipher the doctor's handwriting.
Yeah, the whole thing. So it's actually, this is a notoriously difficult space. So even in the case of what you were talking about, I think there's two issues there. One is you could train something up relatively quickly if you have the data. Getting the data probably costs millions of dollars and takes years. And then two, the accuracy levels that you actually need to achieve are, I would say, in the very, very high 90s. So for what we're doing, 90%, 93%, that's failure, because we can't show that to a patient in real time and have that mean anything to them if the doctors are questioning it all the time.
Right. So you really have to get 98 perfect before you even start.
Yeah, our threshold's 97%.
Wow.
And that's driven by customer need.
Right.
Right.
And then does it go to the doctor, and the doctor goes, yeah, okay, that's good to go through, and you still have a human validation at the end? There's
still a set of human eyes on it. It's meant to be an augmentation tool, and there's a whole other sort of BI analytics effort on the back end that's driving a lot of business decisions, which is a whole other part of the business.
Yeah.
But it is. I would say I would actually classify it as a pretty difficult space. Although you're right that the imagery itself is pretty standardized, which is very helpful.
So the way the images are categorized is the tricky bit. And then going from one hospital to the next, to the next, to the next, and the way that they think about the categorization is also different, I guess?
Yeah, and even things like resolutions and machinery and how much of it is actually digitized. Those are all issues, but ultimately, like getting, if you want to like label, dogs and cats, anybody can kind of do that, and that's cheap labor. If you want to label, tooth decay and caries and bone loss and things like that, or whatever the sort of medical anomaly may be, you actually need experts to do that. So how do you get millions, or really tens of millions of X-rays locally annotated by experts? That's a challenging proposition.
Yeah.
And requires a lot of cooperation by a lot of people, and typically also it's an expenditure.
Yeah. Yeah. So interesting. So obviously there's challenges no matter which way you look at it, and then there's some potential pitfalls as well. So there's this recent thing called deep fake it's been really kind of gaining traction over the last 12 months or so, and it's a school of algorithms around this idea of like mapping a person's face and being able to match it onto another person's face. So it started with being able to mimic the way that their face moved. So you'd look at the person's face and it'd be like, oh, that moves a little bit like Donald Trump, or oh, that's got like an Elvis like lip curl or something like that. But now it's getting really good at just mapping the face onto the face. So it's someone else's body, but with the other person's face mapped on, and with the facial expressions of the original person. So it's really compelling. It works really well. Like you had a Hollywood editor go and do that, and spend tons and tons of time to make that work really well. And you can do it in an instant with Deepfake app, which is you don't even need to be a machine learning engineer to do it. You can use this application for it. So it's a good example of something going from hard to solve, solved, and then very applicable, and then also potentially nefarious. Have you guys, when you think about that and the way that you're approaching the space, are there any things that are popping up or any things you think are important to be looking out for?
I think there's so much that's troubling in this space. I think one very prescient issue is just that of employment. We're basically getting to a point where we've gotten pretty good at replacing physical jobs with machinery, and that's not even that new, but it's getting better. But now we're also replacing sort of cognitive-oriented low-level jobs for which there's no obvious replacement. And you compound that with increasing profits with a smaller number of corporations, and you just have this like massive wealth disparity, which I think is already like becoming a real issue. I think things like deepfakes are also very troubling. Hopefully they're not deployed for like the midterm elections, but they probably will be used for malicious intent. But I also feel like we're going to have a collective awareness of it, and we'll be able to also employ technology to identify it. Mm-hmm. And I think there's solutions there. For some of the bigger societal issues, I don't know that. I think like we're going to have to suffer a lot before the solutions show themselves or before we're prompted to action. Mm-hmm.
So interesting. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think, when it comes to anything that is new, I think this is maybe perhaps a bit optimistic or naive, but I think giving a more, based on what we've seen so far with things like deepfakes or even what's been going on with Facebook or sort of all of these either intended or unintended negative consequences or use cases of technology, and helping for all of us to just have a more, I think, collective and more well-rounded kind of perception of like, should this exist for X number of reasons, not just for ROI or for growth or for one particular use case of Facebook as community. Like, what are the other potential applications of this? And just having a more collective conscious, I think, of those options and those opportunities for good and for bad sits with every kind of individual human being, especially those that are in positions where we are developing this technology, and hopefully, having a more proactive instead of reactive approach to some of those good and bad, applications can just help us to avoid some of those, really icky instances. Mm.
One of the things that we found challenging for our company in particular is that as we started the business, a lot of people wanted to learn. They'd have meetings with us because they wanted to do research. So we had like all this inbound people coming to find us, and then they're just getting in touch. And then the meetings were always about research. So we actually had to build a research division just for training inside of our company to train people that are trying to figure out the space if it made sense for us to work with them. Have there been any challenges that you guys have seen as you've been going through it that you thought were lessons you wish you knew at the beginning as you were setting up, or anything that you thought you've picked up along the way?
I mean, I think for us, in practice, the place, as I said, that this is most real for us is in our work with the Bot Studio. I think some of the things that we've learned there is, and this is taking all the bigness of everything we've talked about and made it into a very, very specific use case. But nonetheless, I think for those of you who are thinking about programming in a one-to-one messaging experience, we've learned that the kind of tree-based, choose-your-own-adventure way of creating those experiences is actually 100 times more labor-intensive and actually not what the consumer wants. They actually aren't coming to you probably with a specific question, and this is not customer service or anything there, but in more narrative-driven experiences, they probably want to be kind of told what they want next. And so there's a very simple example of that in practice is if you're chatting with one of our users and we say, do you want to go into the cave or to the forest, we now actually have to sort of architect two very different narrative paths for you. If you say you're standing in front of a cave, how are you feeling, happy or sad, you're putting them in the cave. Right? And so you only are building the cave track. And so I think there's a lot that we've learned around how to craft experiences that take people where they ultimately need to get to, but without building out extreme volumes of information that frankly no one will ever see, and that people might feel like they're missing out. And so I think a lot around choice, around loyalty, around connections across topic terrains is a place that I think we're getting a lot better at, but maybe didn't start out with that in mind. And I think constantly harkening back to like, well, if I was just a human chatting with my friend, would they send me 12 links, or would they just send me the one that I want? And so I think choice over intention is a really interesting thing that we try to kind of harken back to.
Interesting. Ophir, any kind of lessons that you thought were interesting?
I mean, I think one lesson which people don't like to talk about, but I think is an important one, is this notion of just trial and error, and that sometimes it's just, but rather than trying to sort of express some intuition about like what a neural network would be good at solving, it's better to just like try out the solution, even with a limited data set, and make decisions from there. Because the way that stuff tends to work is oftentimes not aligned with what you would think would be an easy or a hard problem.
Awesome. We left some time at the end for Q&A, and we have some questions on the screen already, as if by magic. The first is from Anonymous. Thank you, Anonymous. How can we get the general public to be more open towards AI and its application across different industries, rather than to see it as a threat? So that is a question for us as speakers. Where should we take that? We could take it down a lot of ways. What do you think?
Yeah, it's a broad question. I think it's a good question. I don't think it's only seen as a threat. I think it's a tremendous opportunity. It's going to be ultimately the greatest wealth creation generator that the world has ever seen. The way that we then sort of take that wealth and manifest it is sort of a human question. I think that also in the like, while AI is sort of narrowly capable, which I think is going to be for quite a while, it's not so much a threat. It's a tool, and we could then use that tool in threatening ways. If you're talking about sort of the ultimate future of superintelligence and general intelligence, I think that's a whole other question, which is interesting, but maybe a little bit outside of the scope. But I think that it's going to become intertwined in sort of every aspect of our lives in ways that will be very natural for future generations. So we're an interesting generation in that we lived kind of before the internet, and then we saw the internet come to be, and we were sort of here before effective AI and now post at least the beginning stages of effective AI. So I think the way that we're able to sort of contemplate these things and interact with them is different than a whole new generation that's just going to be born into these realities and going to accept them in much more fundamental ways. But I'll let you guys talk
Yeah,
about this.
I mean, I think absolutely, and I think the media has a big role to play in people's understanding and access to that kind of information. So, when you think about seeing it as a threat, I think that is even at times a result of the coverage being really extreme. Everything's going to be really awesome, or everything's going to be really horrible. And I think having the kind of curiosity to kind of seek out those opinions that maybe aren't falling on either ends of those spectrums to understand the broader application of AI. So there's a lot of really interesting use cases of AI that are not extreme, right? And so they're not getting the time and attention in the news cycle that perhaps they deserve. And so I think trying to seek out those pockets to understand and just make yourself a more informed consumer, which can be challenging at times, but I think is, for me anyway, has been one of the purest ways to really understand and kind of decipher beyond everyone's going to lose their jobs, machines are coming, and sort of think about, well, actually, like there's, a really interesting AI project that's, capturing glaciers and, showing kids in rural classrooms what endangered species looks like. I mean, there's crazy, really cool, positive applications for it. And I think if you can expose yourself to more of that, you can start to actually kind of imagine the possibilities and have a more balanced point of view on the topic.
Totally. I think it's dangerous when you have companies talk about AIs in this like omnipotent thing that's going to solve all your problems, and it's like this like entity, like it's like a brain, and they give it a name, and then all of a sudden it's doing all this stuff for you, because it just doesn't work that way. So it makes it really complicated to communicate what AI is actually doing and machine learning is doing and how to break it up when you have the marketing message that's like, it's this thing that will sort out your life. And it's just not true. It's a bunch of models that are doing something really interesting, and they are helping, and they are very powerful, and the things they're doing are incredibly helpful when pointed at the right place, when the scope is very narrow and very well delivered. But they're not this like all catch-all thing. And even these devices they're using, these smart assistants, they're not catch-all things. They're just people writing scripts that are based on some intent that you utter, and then it's just connecting it to the thing that it thinks are best. So the way that it's communicated through, I think, is important in order for that to really have applications in other industries, and for other industries to understand how it could be used, and also the public as well. When you have consumer-facing products that are AI-driven, where the AI is exposed to the consumer, they're going to be able to get how it's working, they're going to make sense of it, and they're going to take it and run. And that's when I think it gets really interesting, especially in relation to some specific problems to try and solve. Next question. Where is a good place for an advertising agency to start when applying AI for clients or the organization?
That's a good question.
I would say briefly to that, I would either start by deciding to take it very seriously yourself and build out an in-house staff that understands these capabilities and how to apply them. Because ultimately, like, no amount of trying to leverage, cloud-based resources is going to get you to do anything like that's fundamentally interesting in AI. But alternative to that, you could just be very clear about the problems that you're trying to solve and identify other companies and vendors that are good at solving those problems, and you're effectively then applying those solutions to market. I just wouldn't sort of half-ass it and do the middle route. I would be very clear about whether you're going to invest in it directly or more so indirectly, and do that properly.
I'd agree. Start with the data scientist who has a lot of experience, like 5 to 7 years at least, before diving in. There's another question there around how can we future-proof our jobs in a world of AI. Did you guys have any thoughts on that? It's interesting because the publishing space is completely new, right, yeah, for thinking about AI, and you guys have applied a use case there that seems to be working really well. Yeah. Would you say your writers are thinking about it, or concerned about the way that it's going to go for them, or how is that playing out?
I mean, I think there certainly is a future. Like, there's a lot of like, AI is the future of journalism. I don't think it's the future. I think there is a future. I think there's a lot of sort of service level journalism that can be powered by AI services. We built a Slack bot, for example, when journalists are writing about a paper, they can say, send me some data on agriculture, and we have a trusted database of of data sets that then pulls into Slack really quickly. There's things that can add efficiency to the more tedious elements of the job, but at the end of the day, we are, our staff, even as, like the bot studio, for example, we hired 6 people this year, even though that's arguably the most sort of tech-heavy piece of our business. And so I think, there's, we at Quartz, and I think places that have really strong points of view and aren't doing kind of, here's the weather, here's the train times, here's, what time the movie's playing tonight. Like when you really need a point of view and an expertise and a lens on something, that becomes, I think, even more critical today than perhaps ever before.
Great. That's all the time we have. Ophir, Katie, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.